Okay, so what I've done now is I've cut the brain into two pieces, right and left. So I've done a mid-sagittal section right down the longitudinal fissure, dividing the brain into two somewhat equal halves. And so here I have a mid-sagittal view. Let me point out some of the structures that you see here. This white matter right here that actually connects the two hemispheres is the corpus callosum, and where it bends around, that is called the fornix. Now, if I go above or below the corpus callosum, there's a little hole. That's actually the third ventricle, and you can see that I'm pulling out some blood vessels, and those blood vessels are part of the choroid plexus that makes spinal cord. And so my scissors are in the third ventricle, right above this round body that's called the intermediate mass. So this is the intermediate mass. Remember us seeing the pineal or pineal gland before and the superior and inferior colliculi? So there they are. If we follow around under here, this is going to be considered our fourth ventricle. It's up underneath the cerebellum. Just look at that cerebellum just for a moment. Do you see that it looks like it's a tree with white matter and gray matter? Let it focus. So you can see the white matter is like the branches, and then the gray matter is like the foliage around. That's the cerebellum. And underneath that cerebellum is that fourth ventricle, and then spinal fluid is going to go down the spinal cord, cerebral spinal fluid. So this is the spinal cord, this would be the medulla, this is the pons, this is the midbrain. Here you see the optic nerve, and this is where the pituitary hung from. One other structure, there are two other ventricles. I just put my scissor, that's above the corpus callosum. That's one of the lateral ventricles, so there are two lateral, so that's 1, 2, 3, and then underneath the cerebellum is 4. So now I'm going to move away a little bit, back off of the brain just a little bit, so I can come and color some of those structures for you. So, of course, this is the tree of life, the arbor vitae. It's inside of the cerebellum, the arrangement of the white and gray matter. This is the intermediate mass. It's actually the thalamus, so up underneath the thalamus would be the hypothalamus. Above the intermediate mass, this space, this cavity is called the third ventricle. Underneath the cerebellum, this space is called the fourth ventricle. This piece of white matter that holds the two hemispheres together is the corpus callosum, and it bends around to be the fornix. Some structures we saw before, the pineal gland, the superior colliculus, or that would be a colliculus, together they're colliculi, inferior colliculus. This would be the optic nerve, so that means that this is where the pituitary would hang, under here with the infundibulum. So this would be the medulla region, this would be the pons, and this would be the midbrain. Now let me just say something that has to do with the endocrine system. If this is the thalamus, then under the thalamus would be where we find the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus actually talks by chemicals to the pituitary gland and controls it. And then the pituitary gland releases hormones that control a lot of other organs. So sometimes the pituitary gland is called the master gland, but we know it has a master of its own, the hypothalamus. Something else I'd like to point out while we're on this picture, do you notice that there are valleys and hills on the surface of the cerebrum? Those valleys and hills are called sulci and gyri. The valleys are sulci, the hills are gyri, or a sulcus and a gyrus. And what that does is that increases the surface area for more storage of memory. Let me erase everything and go over it one more time. Cerebellum with the arbor vitae, the cerebrum, the corpus callosum, the fornix, the intermediate mass, the third ventricle, fourth ventricle, the superior colliculus, the inferior colliculus, the pineal gland. This is the optic chiasma. This is where the infundibulum would be holding on to the pituitary gland. As far as the brainstem goes, this would be the medulla, this would be the pons, and this would be the midbrain. And again, the white matter arranged inside of the cerebellum, which is for equilibrium and balance, looks like a tree, so they call it the tree of life, or the arbor vitae.